What's the most disturbing secret you've discovered about someone close to you? My great-grandmother was married to 3 different people at the same time. The men were from different branches of the military. She was collecting all 3 of their paychecks at a time. Story 2. One night as a kid, I heard my parents having an explosive argument in their bedroom which suddenly went quiet. The door was closed and locked. I found out during a drunk phone call from my mother. It was because she attempted to shoot my father, but it didn't go off when she pulled the trigger as there were no bullets. They were both horrified and just stared at each other apparently. They're still together. Story 3. Discovered that my sister stole my father's $25,000 Rolex not more than 24 hours after he died. I only discovered it when her and her husband made a frivolous purchase, and I wondered where they got their money since they were always broke and begging my parents for money. I got suspicious. It hit me that she might have stolen and sold the Rolex, had the paperwork, ran a track on the sales history, and discovered it had been sold to a pawn shop down the street from where my sister lives. Went to the pawn shop, and after a bit of persuasion, got them to tell me who sold it to them, and it was my sister. Me and my mom disowned her. Story 4. Just found out the other day that it wasn't my neighbor's dad who senselessly shot my dog. It was his son, who I was close friends with. He did it on purpose. He knew how much that dog meant to me too. I also found out the other day where he lives. He's an addict now, so I'll just let nature or the police do their thing. Story 5. My former wife, now ex, and I were having problems. I was certain she was cheating on me. I found her notes where she was figuring out and had added up how much I was worth dead. Story 6. My mom received birthday cards with money in them for years from her parents. She kept the cards with the money in them, saving to buy a piano, sentimental reasons. My sister, who has repeatedly stolen from family members, found the collection of cards, money, and took them. My mom only wanted the cards back when she realized what happened. My sister denied everything. Damn you, Emily. Story 7. 2 weeks after I had my daughter, I found out my father and my mother-in-law were having a gross affair. I say gross because my mother-in-law's boyfriend at the time found by logging into her Facebook. She was having so much casual sex with random people and had photos and videos to prove everything. He showed it to my husband. My husband showed it to me and we had to move out of his mom's place. We were helping her pay her rent. This was during the pandemic lockdown, by the way. And I stopped talking to my father. My husband has very limited contact with his mother now. I find it gross because they were both in committed relationships and both preach Christianity and being chaste and all that. It just all gives me the ick. Story 8. I was pretty close with my youngest uncle growing up, at least in pictures. He was in his mid-20 years old when I was like 5 years old for context. One day when I was in middle school, he just stopped coming around completely. My entire family told us kids that he was backpacking around the nation. In high school, I was going a genealogy project on my grandfather, his dad, and accidentally found my uncle's name on the offender registry. Come to find out he was running a CP ring and had served 16 years in federal prison. He's out now and my family pretends nothing happened. I stay far away. Story 9. Graduated boot camp and wondered why my brother wouldn't talk to me. Turns out he was ducking my ex while I was there instead of delivering my letters. Guess guilt ate him up and he thought it was simpler to keep up the lie and not have a brother. Right up until an old friend from my hometown told me what happened. Story 10. My grandfather beat someone to death. My dad was an only child, but my grandmother was once pregnant with my dad's younger brother. But she lost the baby because one guy hit her by the car. While she was in the hospital, my grandfather found the guy and beat him to death. From what I understand, he was in jail for about a week before he was released. Apparently, he claimed temporary insanity due to the circumstances. I learned all this about 4 years ago when my brother was researching family history and asked my grandfather about it. I've always seen him as a nice, little old man. Story 11. During my wife's second trimester, she would stand next to the side of the bed where I slept, holding the black hand axe I use for outdoor stuff and general home defense. She would put the cat in the bathroom and stuff a towel at the bottom so I couldn't hear her scratches or meows. She stated that she would act out hit my neck with some grim details. Our daughter is almost 3 years, and the cat sleeps on my chest since those days and hisses at her at night when she gets up to use the restroom. I was told this last week, and I don't know how to feel. Story 12. My brother was stealing money from father who had dementia. This went on for a year, and I found out about it was because the bank who had my father's mortgage called me wondering why it hadn't been paid in 6 months. My father's bank account went into the negative around this time too, and when I confronted my brother about it, he said, "Well, I gotta pay my bills." I was about to take control of all the accounts and make sure Shot got back on track, but my father ended up in the hospital and died shortly after that. My brother also stole some of my inheritance too. In the end, he stole over $5,000 from his dying father. Story 13. So my grandmother, who's been estranged from my family for a long time now for a multitude of reasons, has this weird thing where she has to share food with people. Are you ordering steak at the restaurant? Well, oh boy, she's got to order the same thing even if she doesn't like steak. Try her drink. It's really good. Take the first bite of chicken to let her know if it's any good. This always really annoyed me because I hate sharing food. One day I brought it up to my mom and she was like, "Oh yeah, Grandma's afraid of being poisoned, so she wants other people to try it first." So let me get this straight. Grandma thinks someone is trying to poison her, so she has me try the food first. And it makes so much sense looking back, because she literally would not take a bite of anything she ordered until someone else had a bite first. Thanks, Grandma. Story 14. In high school, one of my best friends abused his girlfriend, then dumped her. The next day at school, the girl was crying, asking her friends what she did wrong. She did nothing wrong. The guy had been my friend, and I never spoke to him again. Story 15. Found a scrapbook of my mom and a guy I didn't recognize from her immediately post-college days. Turns out he was a long-term boyfriend of hers who took his life away when she broke up with him. My grandfather found his body. I learned at age 20 years old by finding the book to him. Story 16. When my grandfather passed away, we discovered that he did not exist. His name was not in any government registry. He was a normal citizen, paid taxes, had a license, and everything. Lived a long life, married to my grandmother for over 50 years, had multiple children. Everything normal. Still to now, no one knows who he really was and why he had a false name. Story 17. I found out that the reason why one of my uncles didn't want to go back to Korea when he retired was that he couldn't. He was fearful for political reprisals if he tried to return. Turned out his brother was part of the group that assassinated the Korean president back in 1979, and his own innocence was never proven, so he was in fear of getting arrested if he ever tried to go back. Story 18. After my husband died in 2020, I found out he had been having an affair with a 30-year-old. He was 55 years old. Everything he told me about his prior life was a lie, second marriage for both of us. And he had been having sex with men since he was in his early 20 years old. To sum it up, I didn't know this man at all. We had been together 10 years and married for 6. Story 19. Someone I used to call my best friend, her brother, take his life away last year. I never asked questions or anything, just told her I was sorry. My sister at the end of last year told me to Google the brother's name. The brother was stalking his ex-girlfriend, confronted her at her church, beat her and her friend, and they passed away. Then he'd take his life away. I didn't know because the only thing my friend and her mom would post about was how much they missed him and how they wished he was still here. Not a word about the 2 girls he beat and they passed away. Story 20. In high school, I had a friend who I wasn't close with for long, maybe a semester, but we bonded over our mental health struggles at the time. Unfortunately, she'd take her life away not long later, and it wasn't until years later I learned from her best friend what she was really going through. Her parents divorced because her father came out as gay, and she left with her father because she was also gay. Her own brothers spray-painted slurs on their home and slashed tires. Her mother at one point pushed her down a staircase, and she broke her leg. She also had health issues that contributed to her depression, and one day she had enough. Almost a year to the day she passed away, her brother also take her life away, presumably out of guilt. I was told the family was investigated, but the last I heard her mother had started speaking at death prevention events. Story 21. A work colleague appeared on the front page of a national newspaper for a life of fraudulent qualifications. He claimed medical and law degrees, was a brigadier in the Army Reserves, and was the manager for a major Heath Fund. He actually was a brigadier in the Army Reserves. But that and the Heath Fund role were largely built on the fraudulent qualifications and a progression of jobs also based on this claims. In reality, the only qualification he actually held was as a mortuary assistant. Not even his wife knew. The fraudulent degrees had been gained when he was in the Army Reserves recruiting, and he had access to submitted position applications. He came undone when he applied for a government job, and some flags were raised by the recruitment people. He tried to withdraw the application, but didn't realize that an application for a government role has the same weight as a statutory declaration and cannot be withdrawn. It all went south very quickly, and he ended up doing jail time. Story 22. She was my best friend of 7 years. We had literally been through it all together. I moved out of state with my now husband, but she convinced us both to move back to be closer with her after about a year. We had no real ties to the state we had tried out, so we said, screw it, let's go back. She's basically family. We were all so happy to be reunited. She was over almost every night for dinner. We all laughed and talked and had a blast. Best year of my life. Then slowly, she started trying to turn my husband and I against each other. Anytime we had an argument, like any couple does, she would text each of us about how right we were, trying to foster animosity between the two of us. With me, she started talking about how she had a plan B for us, that if my husband and I couldn't make it work, I could move in with her and we'd live happy lives together. With my husband, she started talking about her issues and how she wanted to have a kid just like him. She just needed a donor. This all happened at around the same time, and my husband and I compared texts and figured it out. She wanted to take his semen and have a baby with me. When confronted about it, she refused to admit anything and started lashing out at both of us. It got to the point where she would show up unannounced, banging on the door, demanding a place in our home. It was so terrifying and panic-inducing that we ended up having to move and change our phone numbers. I guess it's so disturbing because I had never had a friend like her, only to find out that she cared about me, but in such an unhealthy and scary way. But yeah, that's my story. Husband and I are great now, BTW. Story 23. Last year, my great-aunt, paternal grandma, her sister, told the family she couldn't live with a secret anymore. My paternal grandmother and her sister are 10 years apart. My grandmother had been married from 20 to a government official, which is my grandfather. My grandfather moved the entire family from a poor country to Europe. My great-aunt told the entire family that from being 10 years to being 19 years, my grandfather abused her every single day and told her that if she told anyone about it, he would immediately move the entire family back and cancel their paperwork. When confronted, my grandfather didn't even say he didn't do it. He just walked away and said the past doesn't matter. Story 24. My great-grandmother came to America in 1918 and was held up in my family as someone who busted her ass to get to America and start a new life. When ancestry searches became a thing, and other family members starting digging into the past, we discovered she fled her home country because she beat her husband and he passed away. And yes, she was terrifying to me as a small child. Story 25. My first boyfriend had psychosis and fantasies about physically harming people close to him. Found that out shortly after we broke up. He was scary either way, but that was crazy. This was actively going on while we were together, and he would say some crazy crap about me to our mutual friends and would threaten to hurt them and their families if they ever told me. Story 26. Ex-roommate and good friend got kicked out for not paying rent. A couple months later, a girl goes missing after her shift at Wendy's and turns up murdered. Guy confesses while on mushrooms to police and is released due to his condition when admitting it. Ran into him a couple weeks after, and I could tell something was up. Turned himself in sober the next day. I used to go to work, leaving my girlfriend at the house with him. You think you know someone. Looking back 15 years later, and it all adds up. Story 27. My former best friend cheated on his wife multiple times. I found out because he tried getting me to cheat on my wife, who he was the best man at for our wedding. Completely ducked. Story 28. The 24 hours before my dad passed away, he was in the emergency room and then in the intensive care unit, and we were unable to be with him because of hospital COVID rules. My mother, sister, and myself had been texting and calling him all day and got no response. My mother even called the hospital and spoke with one of his intensive care unit nurses who said he was awake and communicating fine. He passed very quickly at 3:30 a.m. the next morning. We were allowed to be at his bedside, but by then, he was no longer conscious. So we said our goodbyes, and he was gone. Later that morning, while my mom slept, I was calling cremation services to schedule his body for pickup at the hospital, and going through his bag of belongings, the hospital had returned to us. His phone was in there, and I wanted to read all our texts and take some comfort in my last words to him. I opened his phone, and all our texts had not been read. Not mine or my mom and sister's. I thought this was so odd, but figured he must have been suffering so much he couldn't find the strength. I began to scroll through his apps and noticed a chat app I'd vaguely heard of. I can't recall the name, but it essentially works like WhatsApp. I opened the app and saw a single contact with a female name. I started reading and realized my dad has been chatting with this girl hourly for the last 24 hours and as far back as I could scroll. He was calling her princess and telling her he loved her, and she was saying she was scared for him and wanted to know what was going on. Why was he in the air, etc.? I scrolled back enough to know that this was someone he was having at the very least an emotional affair with. My grief was completely hijacked by hurt and anger, and a week later, I tracked the girl down and spoke to her and found out she was 19 years old. He was her high school bus driver, and she told me they had been dating for almost 2 years. My dad was 66 years old when he died and dating someone younger than his grandchildren, someone he chose to spend his last moments with and say his last goodbyes to. I hope it made him happy, but it sure is a crafty secret to live the rest of my life with. A secret that will forever overshadow my entire relationship with my dad with no chance to ever speak to him about it. It's the one secret I wish I'd never found out. Story 29. My extended family on my mom's side has a strange practice of turning horrific family events into funny stories to tell at family gatherings and the like. I believe mostly as a way to deal with the trauma. The time my grandfather tried to hit my grandmother in their living room with the kids present, or when my mom got beat for saying Billy D. Williams was hot, were among those stories, both of which were told at Christmas parties, even when I was very young. The only stuff that doesn't get turned into fun stories is the stuff that no one knows how to process and just wants to bury. And that stuff I've only gotten tiny glimpses at, probably for the best. The one that stands out is when my grandmother let slide that my grandfather was in the Ku Klux Klan, participated in lynchings, and was really proud of how good he was at it. Or when I found out later in life that the only reason I saw him growing up when none of my cousins did was that he knew where my mom lived, but not his other kids, and that us not visiting wasn't an option. Which did make sense, considering his house and everything that happened in it was, in retrospect, weird as all hell. Like hanging out with the mute grandkids of his new wife, as they played with dead rats in Barbie clothes in a dollhouse made of reclaimed driftwood levels of weird. Story 30. Probably not the most disturbing, but I recently learned that my brothers and I are the product of our father's second family. Apparently, he had a first family and my mother lured him away from them. His firstborn son was his name Junior, and he apparently passed away in the 90s, about 10 years after he started a family with my mother. The guy I knew as my righteous and morally sound beacon in life straight up ditched his family for a new woman to start a new family. He never spoke to them again. I'll never look at my parents the same again. My older brother and I have gotten closer since finding out which is cool, but it's so damn disturbing to me how much we were lied to. Story 31. Met a super nice guy at a networking event when I just starting out in tech. He had a ton of connections and was a nice family man. Super rich. Eventually we became friends and he was acting as a mentor figure to me in the industry. Went over to his massive new house, met his family, etc. He had the demeanor and looked like Al Borland from Home Improvement, to give you an idea. Like 4 years later, I was looking at the offender registry map for my local area while I was shopping for houses. Lo and behold, his house popped up. In the early 2000s, he was convicted of co-running a commercial CP sales site. Served 5 years for it in federal prison. Story 32. They were close to my dad, not me as I was a child at the time. He would come over and play with my dad and his friends. One night, his neighbors phoned the police as he was setting off makeshift fireworks. Eventually, police were able to search his place and found he had been planning on blowing up a mosque and was inspired by Anders Behring Breivik. My dad gave witness evidence of a time when this friend offered him a stolen piece of wall from Hitler's bunker. Story 33. I found out that my aunt, who was 13 at the time, was abused by her uncle, my great-uncle, and had a baby in a cellar in the basement of her house. The baby didn't make it, so she and her little sister buried it there. Years later, when the aunt, who had repressed those memories, had a baby, she remembered it all. When her family found out, she was labeled the escort of the family. My dad's side is garbage. Story 34. My dad's whole life was outlandish fabrications and tall tales and outright lies. Honestly, the most disturbing secret was uncovering. Slowly as I grew up, that he was full of crap and just a vanilla guy who preferred partying and getting ducked up with his friends and talking big than actually doing any of those things with me. I guess the secret is that he was a lousy dad. Story 35. So my now husband, engaged at the time, and I are teachers and did a couple-year stint in bush, rural Alaska. It was pretty intense, but a great adventure. Learned a lot we wanted and a lot we didn't. We befriended one of our colleagues, an older single man who seemed friendly enough. We would often go over for dinner, go hiking, and go shoot his gun collection at a local rural beach using the school's Honda. Rural life. No animals or local fauna were harmed. He took on the role of an uncle figure for us. We stayed at his air-spare bedroom at his house in the city on vacation once, too. Now, our second year teaching there, he brings along this young woman at the start of the school year who he claims is his niece, and she never leaves his house. He claimed she was having trouble living with his brother, and she was taking classes online to graduate, and she confirmed this with myself and other women in the village. Cut to spring, she leaves for home separately from this man, and people ask why. He claims she patched things up with his brother, her dad, and went home. It turns out, this girl was basically an underage girl he met online, and her father tracked her down after she contacted a local woman about her situation, and sent a state trooper to escort her home. She had been reported missing for 8 months prior. Ducked up part was, on top of going to court for that situation starting the following summer, he tried to coax another underage girl offline to live with him the following school year. And it turns out that entire chat history was a sting by the FBI. He's in prison now, until 2043. Story 36. My ex-friend dated a guy who was abused as a kid by his neighbor who was an elderly woman. The friend didn't react or comfort him when he told the story. She shrugged it off and started complaining about random stuff. I was really shocked. Story 37. Cousin who played Santa at the family Christmas gathering was arrested for CP. Police report said the garden's officers were disturbed due to the young age of the subjects in the video. After reading parts of his charts that were released to the public, he's not coming near anyone in the family again. Thought I might see him at our grandma's funeral last month, but very glad I didn't. Story 38. My best friend in high school had a brother who was only a year older than her. I wasn't close friends with him or anything, but I always liked him when we were younger, in a friendly way. He was always goofy and seemed kind-hearted, even though he did consistently stay in trouble as a teen. He has had a serious drinking problem ever since middle school. I knew he had some demons, but I never thought he was a bad guy. Well, anyway, I lost touch with my friend for a few years after high school, but when we ran into each other a while back, we had a long catch-up session. While talking, I couldn't help but notice that she hadn't mentioned her brother at all. That is odd, considering that he has always been present in her life. So I asked about him. Apparently, her brother had abused a 12-year-old boy when he was in his mid-20 years. The boy's family found out about it and pressed charges against him. I was absolutely shocked. I knew he had some serious emotional issues, and I knew he had been dealing with substance abuse, but I never thought he would do something like that. At most, I imagined him being in and out of jail for random, petty substances-related charges, or maybe even go to prison for a substances-related felony charge. I never thought this was the direction his life would take. My friend said that she thinks his issues make it extremely difficult to have healthy relationships with people his own age, that he feels safer socializing with people much, much younger. She told me that after the charges were pressed, he was an absolute wreck, as if he were going through a breakup with another adult. It wasn't the charges that bothered him. It was the fact that he seriously considered this kid to be his boyfriend and he didn't want to lose him. Not that this makes anything. He did less ducked up. It was just shocking to me to hear just how warped this guy I grew up with was, and I never knew it. All this time you think you know a guy. Story 39. The reason Grandma moved away when my dad was still a baby, to a big city, more than 3 days away from her family, was because she beat her stepfather and he almost passed away. It was a very small village. Later, she told me he was an abuser. She didn't elaborate on that, and I didn't ask any follow-up questions. She ended the convo with, "I did the right thing." We never met her side of the family. Story 40. My Nana, on my mom's side, take her life away. I didn't find this out until I was in my late 30 years old, I think. She passed away when I was about 10 years old. I was told she was found in the bathroom, which isn't uncommon. I always figured she went into the bathroom and had a heart attack. I never thought anything of it. She came up in a conversation with my sister for some reason, and she filled me in. Nana had osteoporosis and was in a lot of pain all the time. One morning, she decided she was done. I could have gone the rest of my life not knowing that info. Story 41. While my cousin was walking around with her son in the woods, she came across a hunting stand. She climbed it and found a pair of binoculars. Sitting straight forward and lifting the binoculars to her eyes, she saw her own bedroom window. Let's be logical here. If it was a legit hunting stand, it was facing and closer than 500 feet to a residence, which is illegal, which means it had to come down with prejudice. If it was a peeping Tom, well, it had to come down with prejudice. When my brother and I visited not long after, she showed us where it was. We tore it down and literally wrapped it around a couple trees, bent the ducker to complete uselessness. I got an angry call the next day. "Did you tear down a hunting stand yesterday?" "Damn yeah, I did." "That was your uncle's," her mother's brother. Turns out my cousin reported it to the family and they ignored the issue. When the uncle was asked, he said there was just an old tree house out there. Even when he was exposed, they didn't really care. They were more upset about the damage we did. Suffice it to say, I have written off most of that side of the family. Story 42. The academic director of my college turned out to be a former United States military that ran away from the country after he was condemned for abusing his 2 stepsons. He was in the ran away for 33 years. He faked his degree, documents, used a new name and everything. We only discovered over summer break when he was discovered, taken to prison, and take his life away there. The mother ducker claimed he had a doctorate from a university that didn't even exist. Story 43. I was pretty good friends with this guy who ran a hobbies cafe, basically a place where you could play trading card games, board games, and that sort of thing. Every Saturday, he offered a service where he'd put on children's days, which would usually involve watching movies on the projector, Pokemon tournaments, etc. It was great for a lot of the local parents in the area who could use the day to complete their chores with their kids out of the house, and so there was always 20 or so kids in there every week. But then a few years back, it was revealed he had approximately 1 terabyte of illicit CP on his computer. Story 44. My brother was a United States military policeman 30 years ago. He recently admitted he wasn't stationed in an undisclosable location while in the armed forces. Instead, he was actually in prison for manslaughter. He got into an off-duty drunken dispute in a bar. Story 45. To make sense, you have to know I have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and with it comes severe memory loss in my case. With that being said, on to the answer. My mom sat me down at 16 and told me she walked in on my grandfather abused me at 2 weeks old. No one is sure when it stopped. I always felt off and had anxiety, depression. But as soon as she told me, she also explained it happened to her. She knew he was a monster, yet continued letting me be raised by him. I had all the symptoms growing up, including wetting the bed until I was 13 years old. I told people growing up I knew something was wrong, and people told me I was a dramatic girl or that I was a liar. He reoffended a few years ago. That's when people started to believe me. Honestly, it's rough in spending your whole life being invalidated, invisible, and just really alone. I'm in my 30 years old and still am very just lost and feel completely hopeless. I'm not sure how to move on. Story 46. Figured out a few years after I married my first wife that she had had an ongoing sexual relationship with her first cousin before she met me. I figured it out sitting around a campfire with the way they looked at each other. Update due to the interest. I always knew he was her favorite cousin, but never knew or suspected anything until that night around the fire. It was just us three at that point, and I've always been great at reading people, well, except the woman I dated. Anyway, I just saw a look between them, and I knew without a doubt, and just asked them straight out when they first hooked up. She was so stunned she admitted it instantly and said, "How did you know?" Then she said, "Oh, I wonder if anyone else in the family figured it out. They slept together off and on for at least 2 years before I met her. But since that time, I suspect it was after she met me also." Another fact that was withheld before our marriage was she was bipolar and untreated. Things got back. Lucky to walk away. I divorced her in 2014. I can tell you that as of last year, I told a female cousin of hers that hates her guts, so I'm sure the family knows now. Story 47. An uncle beat a guy almost to death. He had walked in on a friend abuse a kid. He had to pay a fine and do community service for a long time, but also didn't have to pay for beer at the local bar for a few months. He was so reserved and kind, so it threw me when I found out what he'd accomplished in his younger years. Story 48. My ex-girlfriend of 6 years admitted that she wasn't abused. Her whole life identity was pretty much surrounded by her abuse accusation. The $15,000 I put towards her therapy. Every time she was having a bad day, she'd blame the post-traumatic stress disorder. Every time I had my buddies over, she'd want them gone because post-traumatic stress disorder. Whenever I went out, she wanted me back home because post-traumatic stress disorder. And to top it off, she faked triggers. Like she'd see a red Corvette and start flipping out because she said the person who abused her drove a red Corvette. Absolutely damn nuts. It honestly still pisses me off and see red when I think about it. Real people have had real assault happen to them. And people like that are why some of them aren't taken seriously. Story 49. That my mother consulted forums of people to assist in her take her life away. I had a troublesome relationship with her, but I'll never forgive them for telling her to keep trying. Story 50. When I was 5 years old, I knew my mother cheated on my father, without even having proper vocabulary to say anything. My mom took my sister and I to the hotel to meet him, and while my sister and I were in the other bed asleep, my mom slept with him. I knew, because the next morning I woke before my mom. The covers on the other bed were up just enough that I could see mom was without clothes. I didn't know exactly what this meant at the time, as I was only 5, but I knew I felt icky about it. A few years later, I knew enough to understand what I knew. Story 51. That they were abused at 6 years old by a then teenage cousin. We have nothing to do with that entire side of the family because of this. It is a very horrible family secret that is difficult to talk about, or just tell other family members about, obviously. The craphead abuser is married with kids of his own now, but really if there was any justice in this world, he should be rotting in prison IMO. Story 52. Probably not the most disturbing thing I've seen, but caught my dad and sister together. They don't know, I know. This was 10 years ago when my mom was dying her at the time. They probably still do it. I see my dad less than once a year. Story 53. My ex's mom didn't really keep this a secret, but she was repeatedly abused by her own father growing up, and her own mother would let men choose one of her daughters to obviously abuse and assault as they please if they bought her a bottle of liquor. Story 54. My vile aunt destroyed her third husband's will, so she inherited everything and his children got nothing. Same aunt intercepted gifts, cards sent to my cousins by their father after divorce. She presented gifts as from her, told kids their father forgot them, didn't care. First husband, cousin's father, divorced her because he came home and found a neighbor man wearing his robe and sitting in his chair. Story 55. When I was young, I had vague ideas about my uncle being dodgy, in that at family events such as weddings, etc., my parents would tell me and some of my cousins to stay away from him. When I was in year 8, we were doing a lesson in citizenship class where we had to cut out pieces from a newspaper, no idea why, and I came across an article saying he'd been recommitted to Broadmoor Prison. Went home and Googled him and found out he'd been in prison in the 80th for kidnapping and abused someone, and had been in and out of prison since for other offenses. He also tried to sue the Sun once for defamation, since they printed something incorrect about him. He was awarded 1 pens by the court because it technically was defamation, but it was agreed that what they had printed couldn't have damaged his reputation any further. All I know is that he was in a halfway house for a long time, however. From what I've gathered, he was released around 5 years ago. Story 56. My granduncle passed away in the year when I was born. It always got the beating around the bush treatment. He passed away young and suddenly, alcohol took him. It took a visit to the graveyard with my father above the age of 30 years old when he finally told the whole story. He was a medical technician. Due to a chronic issue, he lost his job and not long after that, divorced. Got together with someone else, but he couldn't recover from the loss of his job and eventually take his life away. For long years, a severely depressed man's struggle with health and family issues with no help to come was sold to me as an anti-alcohol, only because as a bad way of self-medicating, he spent his last worst days with heavy drinking. I don't understand the secrecy, whether if it's for the repurposed story or a family-wide shame over the true one. And knowing that depression runs deep in the family, I find it terribly harmful that such a tragedy still doesn't make them see the writing on the wall and admit that the problem is real. The official story is still death from alcoholism-related complications. Story 57. I had a friend I knew for 20 years old take his life away. I got the call early in the morning, right before I left to work. I remember sitting in my car crying in disbelief, but still had to go to work. I put my phone on Do Not Disturb for the entire workday, though. When I got home, I discovered many texts and voice messages on my phone. I read them and listened to them all. In doing so, I found out why he had taken his life away. The FBI had come to raid his house for a warrant for CP earlier that morning. He proceeded to barricade himself into the house, having a standoff with the feds. The standoff ended with his death. There was no warnings that showed at all about that man. He was a friend to so many and people loved him. First, I grieved the loss of my friend, and then I grieved the person I thought I knew. All in one day, gone. Story 58. My coworker. I always thought he was a little strange, but he was the head underwriter, so eventually we become kind of close. I got a call from a buddy of his that was concerned. At that point, I told his buddy that the guy had quit the job 2 weeks before. The buddy asked me if I could check on him at his house. He said he would check, but he lives 2 hours away from him. I checked, and some older guy told me that he was okay, but that I wouldn't hear from him for a while. Fast forward 1 week, I get a call that he had been arrested for CP. Story 59. My grandfather is a ghost on paper. We always grew up knowing he had skeletons in his closet, but I wasn't prepared for what he had done in his younger years. I started hearing rumors as a teen that he had been a pretty big-time robber. His specialty was cracking the safes, but he would never admit it. In 2016, he randomly told me he also used to deal guns to the IRA like he was talking about the weather. It was bizarre. He also told me he helped a couple of triads hide out in Jamaica after they went on the run for death and adversary. They were fairly nice guys, according to him. It was only about 10 years ago. He finally stopped sleeping with guns stashed under his bed and taking shady phone calls down the bottom of the garden. Only my grandmother knows his real name. No one else in the family does. I adore him, but he is an enigma to me. Story 60. When I found out that both my best friends from way back were being investigated for domestic terrorism. Or I should say when I was reminded, because apparently this happened while we were still friends and I was aware at the time. We had a lot of other issues, so I guess I decided to throw that one on the back burner. But it says a lot about my high school experience that was the thing I decided to forget. Story 61. Discovered that my own mother paid bribes to my then social services worker to make my life a living hell. I was in foster care from 11 years to 18 years because she was mistreating me. I won't get into the details, but it was physical, psychological in nature. I was under the state's protection, but suddenly got imprisoned without any reason. Got to endure other forms of torture or revenge as well. Finally got a lawyer at 16 years old. He found all the evidences, got in court. She lost the small amount of legal custody she still had. Social services worker got kicked out and banned of his profession, and I got my emancipation. The judge was not amused. I'm 41 years old, and she still try to make my life a living hell once in a while, even if I move. Story 62. Once a really drunk friend who I knew growing up and started hanging out with again after high school told me that he was at one point an enforcer, debt collector for a dealer, and that he shot a homeless person just for fun. I smoke and do psychedelics. I thought I was the bad influence. Story 63. Backed out of a Miami trip with a group of folks after I found some of them talking trash about others. A new friend I introduced to the group decided to go anyway, against my advice. She was abused by a friend of the leader's boyfriend during the trip. Everyone in the shared Airbnb was aware this happened, and no one said anything. No one removed the guy. They all blamed the new girl for getting drunk, and since she'd hooked up with the offender in the past, she must have wanted it or been okay with it. The victim didn't want to pursue any legal action because of the way everyone blamed her. I don't associate with anyone who went on that trip anymore, and I'm very vocal as to why when others ask. Story 64. My dad had a sister only few people knew about. She was born with a brain defect. My grandparents kept her in the apartment for all her life because they were ashamed. Story 65. Friend of mine in school. We weren't best friends or anything, but we hung out and I went over to his house a few times. Lost touch after school ended and went to college. Found out a few years later he'd been convicted of ownership of CP. Turns out he'd discovered it on his dad's computer, and both ended up being convicted at the same time. The wife, was apparently none the wiser until police raided the house. Makes me shudder to think, having been round there, how long it had been going on for. Story 66. Found a cousin abused his little sister. Found out my grandfather was seen pleasure himself while I was sitting on his bed. He had abused at least 4 of his 5 daughters. Story 67. My aunt was plotting to abuse her underage grandson with a cop she met online dating. I've got a dozen aunts, and this one was, seemingly, the most mild-mannered and innocent one. I always felt bad for her because her daughter had a kid when she was young, and then her life went off the rails. And so my aunt got custody of her grandson when he was less than a year old. When he was around 9 years, my aunt left her husband and then started online dating. She was talking with a guy who was a cop. We later found out he had a history of befriending women with kids and then abused their children. Anyways, my aunt definitely has some issues with men and wanting to feel wanted by men. So she went along with a lot of the stuff this cop was suggesting they'd do to her grandson. Would she have actually done it? I think so, but the opinion is split in my family, especially because this aunt is typically such a goody two-shoes. Anyways, the cop ended up getting busted and went to prison, as he had done this with multiple women and children, and my aunt got sentenced for a felony conspiracy. Story 68. Out of my group of friends in high school, they all got strung out on meth. They had a story that a friend of mine was almost abuse. So she pulled her knife and beat with the knife this guy. I have no idea what the truth is, but they were kind of hush-hush about the situation until it eventually got back to me. Story 69. A friend baby trapped her boyfriend at the time, now husband. He did not want kids. He was full on no babies, and even though she was on the pill, he used condoms. She wanted babies. She admitted to a couple of us while drunk that she ducked a couple of them. I was horrified by this and cut that ducker out of my life. What is worse is some of the women who she told agreed it was the smart move. To my knowledge, they are together. This was over 10 years ago, and I haven't spoken to them since. Story 70. My sister's first kid is likely not my brother-in-law's biological kid. He has no idea she was unfaithful to him, and the likely biological father also has no idea the kid exists. Oh boy. Story 71. That my mom cheated on my dad for 20 years and still hasn't told him to this day. I'm still trying to figure out what to do and how to go about the situation and exposing the truth about her to my dad. But I'm afraid he would die of a broken heart. Worst thing is, she cheated with my godfather, who used to come to the house and drink coffee with my mom and dad every day. Story 72. Super simple, but my dad kept his cigarette habit hidden from me and my sister. Imagine my shock when I go outside looking for him and see a huge cloud of smoke. 9-year-old me was dumbfounded. Also made sense why he always had to get his wallet from the car. Story 73. A former friend of mine from childhood was a youth pastor at a summer church camp. Turns out he was grooming young girls and teens both at camp and online after camp was over. Only reason I found out was back in 2011, he was in his late 20s at the time, one of the girls told her parents and the cops posed as her online while he pleasured himself into a webcam. The cop then convinced him to drive 3 hours to go meet and have sex. When he showed up at the girl's place in the middle of the night, the cops were waiting and arrested him. He's now a convicted sex offender and did time in jail. The crazy part? Once he got out, he moved to Texas and married a divorcee that had kids. He's also now the dean of online studies at his church and is responsible for growing the number of students taking classes online. Story 74. This may not be the most popular answer, but my elderly mother in another state would lie to me about her health and well-being. I always kept close tabs because she was in her 80 years old, and everything appeared to be fine till I got a call from her friend who filled me in on what was really happening. A lot of bad health stuff, it turns out. Long story short, ended up in assisted living ultimately as she needed it. I hear this happens a lot as the elderly don't want to be put in a home. But in her case, she was literally on the verge of accidentally killing or dangerously injuring herself. So while it sucked to have to go to assisted living, if she truly wanted to live as long as possible, it was necessary. And the place was quite nice anyway. Moral of this story, if your loved ones are elderly, do more than just take their word on how they are really doing if you are able. Story 75. My husband's best friend is gay. He's been married to a woman for 10 years and has known my husband for half his life. As far as I know, me and my out-gay friend are the only ones who know. It's not disturbing that he's gay. It's just sad he's been living a lie. What was the most disturbing thing you saw in person? About 8 years ago, I working as a train conductor, my locomotive engineer and I hit a young woman with an 8,000-ton freight train. After applying the emergency brakes, it was my job to get out and visually check to see if we indeed had an accident. I found her contorted body in seemingly impossible ways near the side of the tracks. I radioed 911 to my dispatcher, and emergency services were immediately called. She unfortunately passed away not long after the ambulance arrived. Story 2. I was no contact with my abusive addict mom for many years. She passed in 2020. A sheriff's deputy found her during a wellness check. It was declared that she had been passed away for a couple of weeks in July heat with no utilities. My father and I drove to her house the day after they removed her body. You could smell the decomposition from a block away. She had canceled trash services and had 3 years of garbage bags piled to the ceiling in her garage. There were rats running all over the house. 99% of our family pictures were pissed on or eaten by rats and not salvageable. Both of her toilets were out of order and full to the brim with crap. Everything I saw in her house was absolute nightmare fuel. Story 3. First day when husband and I moved to a new town, we saw a dog on the road. We got out and tried to catch him. My husband ran ahead and I needed to stop because of my asthma. I remember sitting and an old lady came and sat next to me, calming me down. I was panicking because I was afraid of my husband getting hit. When I got my breath and caught up with him, he quickly shoved my face into his chest and begged me not to look. All I could hear was the screams and crying from the dog's owners and the magnifying silence of the town. The dog was being watched by a sitter and got loose. At this point, the whole town froze in effort to catch this dog, but it just took one car to sadly take his life. I remember crying all night as I recently just lost our dog. I couldn't imagine losing a pet in such a horrible situation. I think about that dog often and hope the family was able to get some closure. The only positive was seeing how united the town was to try and help the dog. Poor baby. Story 4. When I was about 9 years old, our family was staying at a campground on a river in northern Michigan. A boy had wandered off and was missing. The entire park was looking for him. After about 2 hours, with no luck, some of us began looking in the water at the ends of the docks nearby. When I dove down in about 4 feet of water, I found him floating just off the bottom of the river. I pulled him to the surface and shouted for help. The ambulance service made an effort to resuscitate him, to no avail. As horrible as that was, the thing that I will never forget was the sound his mother made when I carried him ashore. I still enjoy boating and swimming, but I have a very healthy respect for the water. Story 5. My best friend and I were supposed to be pet house sitting, and when we showed up on the first day, the owner, guy who hired us, and his brother were both passed away in the house. There was a note. Younger brother showed up at the house in a substances-fueled rage, and older brother didn't know it was him and shot him. Then when he realized who it was, he wrote a note and take his life away. Story 6. My dad take his life away when we were home alone. I found his jacket floating in the air in the roof of our barn. It took me a few seconds to realize my dad was wearing the jacket. I climbed up to the hayloft and held him up the best I could. It was before you always carried your phone with you and we lived on the country. I don't know for how long I screamed for help, but no one heard me and I was getting tired from his weight. I had to let go. I ran back and called 911 as quick as I could, and a neighbor to help me. Grabbed a knife and together we cut him down and did artificial respiration. I was taken away when the ambulance and police came, but I know they shocked his heart and got it beating. This happened on a Wednesday, and he was declared brain dead, but it gave family, relatives, and friends to visit, sit by his side and say goodbye. He passed away peacefully on Saturday with my mom and brother by his side. It ducked me up for a long time, and 2 decades later, I still can't see that type of jacket without being reminded. Story 7. Was walking through a city with a friend when we saw a guy on a bike, no helmet, come down a steep street right in front of us. Something made his bike flip, and he went headfirst onto the stone cobble street. Ambulance and so on showed up pretty fast, but I have no idea if he survived. Story 8. I man pass away on the sidewalk, and everyone walking over him like it was nothing. It was absolutely horrifying. Nothing I could do to help no matter who I told. I was working in Luanda, Africa, and had recently come offshore and on my way back home to the US. I decided to walk around and see the sights when I walked up on him. It's been 5 years, and it's still burned into my memory. Story 9. My friend seized and passed away in front of me at the airport in San Salvador. We were there on a connecting flight and had been at our gate for a few hours. We were sitting next to each other at our gate. I'm talking to her, but not looking, and suddenly hear odd noises coming from her. I look over and she's having a full-on seizure, eyes rolling to the back of her head, uncontrollable getting motion, frothing at the mouth, etc. Her face began to turn blue. She couldn't breathe because of the saliva in her throat. Other people began to turn away and leave. The medics got there too late. Story 10. Air nurse, trauma code on a middle-aged gentleman who wrecked his car, basically passed away on arrival and didn't make it. The ambulance that dropped him off had to do a speed clean of the gurney to rush out to another call immediately. 30 minutes later, it brings in an old lady who had fallen at home. She kept saying she can't get a hold of her son, and he was supposed to take her to the hospital. Turns out her son was the one who wrecked his car on his way to take his mom to the hospital. And she was brought in on the same gurney that her passed-away son was just laying on moments earlier. That was a gut punch having to tell her the bad news. Story 11. When I was a child, my father was a violent alcoholic. One day I looked outside and saw him repeatedly slamming the hood of our car on Mom. I ran outside crying, and he stopped. No child should see this kind of thing, but children are exposed to it every day. My father passed away in a terrible accident while I was still a child. Before he died, I saw many other terrible acts against my sweet mother. Story 12. Saw a guy full-on punch his girlfriend in the face one Halloween, like 2 feet away from me. I was much larger back then. So I just tackled him, and another guy helped me keep him till my, at the time, girlfriend went and got a cop. Busy college town, they were always around. The worst part comes into play when she was fighting me and the guy helping the entire time, saying he was just drunk, blah blah. Like, damn, what manipulative crap has that guy been doing to this girl? We left when the police arrived, so I don't really have much of an ending to the story. Sorry. Story 13. Abuse in the middle of a street. I thought they were strangers, and that she was trying to get away from him, and he wouldn't accept it. He kept holding on to her and trying to drag her with him while she kept begging him to let her go. We stopped and she looked at us and asked for help. He took off when he saw us walk towards them. She then let us know that they were married. but at least she wouldn't get beaten up that night since we interfered. She would go spend the night at her sister's place, and she wouldn't divorce him because there were kids involved. I hope she did end up divorcing him. And those kids weren't too scarred of having to survive growing up with their father beating their mother. Story 14. It's been the most disturbing thing I've been witness to. My childhood friend had been diagnosed with cancer and was in the hospital receiving chemo treatment. I gathered enough strength to go and see him. We talked for a bit when a nurse came in covered in protective gear and holding an IV in her hands. My friend sort of smiled and thanked the nurse when she left. He turns me to and he says, "There is my daily poison." Sure enough, it was his chemo treatment in the IV, complete with a skull and crossbones label on it. He passed away a month later at home. Story 15. I was walking back to my office after going out for coffee when I saw someone jump from their apartment high-rise balcony and, for lack of better terms, passed away. Story 16. Witnesses a rollover during a blizzard. I called for emergency services as I approached and assessed the situation. One of the occupants was partially ejected through the sunroof and had pinned beneath the vehicle. He was alive and conscious, but in dire need of extrication. He was screaming about the pressure. Myself and others arriving collected vehicle jacks and began trying to lift the vehicle off of him. We were making good progress. We had managed to make some space for him, but he was still stuck when the firemen arrived and took over. They replaced our jacks with dunnage, think wooden railway ties, in a stack, and then used airbags to lift the vehicle. Unfortunately, as the weight of the vehicle was taken by the airbags, everything slid and the dunnage collapsed. The vehicle landed full force on him with a sickening crunch, and that was it. I had almost gotten this man out, but the professionals took over. Story 17. When I was around 9 years old, I saw a woman jump from a bridge and passed away. We stayed and waited for the rescue team to come and pull her out of the water. They managed to find her despite the strong currents. I remember seeing her being carried by one of the emergency crew. People rarely survive that jump. It happens a lot in my hometown, sadly. At the time, I wasn't really super horrified. I knew what happened, and to this day, I remember every second of the whole ordeal. I remember her clothes. I remember seeing her on a bench under the bridge as we walked to the park where we'd later see her jump. I remember thinking that she looked sad, and that maybe it would be nice if someone talked to her. I feel guilty for not having done anything to help her. Story 18. My own mother being attacked by a dog while holding the cat I'd grown up with. Our neighbors raced greyhounds, and our cat was sunbaking outside on the veranda. One of their greyhounds had escaped the pen they were housed in and wasn't wearing a muzzle. Unfortunately, our cat was the first live thing the dog spotted at the same time my mother walked out the front door. She tried quickly grabbing the cat, but by the time she had gotten to him, the dog had reached our veranda, knocking my mother off onto the ground a few feet down, and began to fight for both of their lives. Luckily, I was home at the time, as well as my father, who was asleep after a long night at work. I heard her screams for help, ran outside to the scene, and was stunned for a few moments, before screaming for my father, who raced outside to try separating the dog from them both, who had by this time ripped shreds into my mother's arms and dislocated our cat's hip. But luckily, both were alive. A ranger and ambulance was called, and then a few days later, police attended. Although when they approached our neighbors to locate the dog, they had hidden it away on another property which was eventually located. To this day, years on, they have never approached any of us to apologies. Story 19. Entering a friend's place for the first time without prior knowledge that he is a hoarder at age 40. Total shock. Dude has normal job, friends, etc. But an absolute hoarder. Dead mice in the flat, trash in the kitchen reaching almost to the ceiling, mold everywhere on one wall of the bedroom. I didn't dare to use the bathroom. Utter shock. Story 20. Around the age of 5, I was living with my family on my grandfather's farm. One day while my father was working, I was home alone with my mother. She went to take a bath while I was watching TV. After my show ended, I realized she wasn't anywhere in the living room, kitchen, or master bedroom. It was a trailer home, so not big. I went to check the only bathroom, and she was completely submerged underneath the bathwater from having a seizure. I ran to go get my grandfather and called 911 like I was taught as he tried to revive her artificial respiration. The paramedics eventually arrive and are able to revive her, but only for a brief period before her heart gives out again and they pronounce her dead. Story 21. When I was really young, around 8 years old, I'm not sure, we was playing at our school, and boy kicked an ball over the fence and jumped it to get it back. The problem, several very big and angry dogs. My whole class saw that boy passed away. Story 22. I've seen and been through a lot, all different flavors of trauma. I have one moment I think about a lot, though. I was working at a Walgreens. It had a liquor store that was separate from the main store. I was headed over there to count the drawer and close up when a mother, obviously hammered, walks out having purchased a bottle of vodka, with her little boy walking timidly next to her. As I was walking by, she drops like a sack of potatoes and starts seizing. The little boy started screaming, crying, and runs to hide behind a trash can just outside of the store. I yelled for my coworker to call 911 and sat there with this little boy talking to him, asking his name, telling him his mom was going to be okay and not to look. I remember holding his hand and walking him to the ambulance and introducing him to the EMTs, who were very kind and lifted him into the front seat of the ambulance. I was that kid once. I lived that same situation, almost exactly. I didn't have anyone to talk to me while I waited for the ambulance that I called myself. I just sat there and cried and watching my own mother seize. Story 23. Dude, that was clearly off his nuts. Squat down on the street corner, take a dump, then pull it apart and taste it. Dude acted like it was the most normal thing in the world, like chomping on a nice bit of chocolate. No shame. Then there was me sitting outside the bar, traumatized and gagging. Story 24. Driving home one night, I stopped at a light and caught a glimpse of a street person pulling a shopping cart in the road down the cross street. Lost sight of him quickly because it was poorly lit. A few seconds later, there was a shower of sparks as an oncoming car plowed into the guy and his shopping cart. He was passed away immediately. Story 25. My mom's strung out after an overdose of sleeping pills. She tried to take his life away. I was 21 years old and almost left the house without noticing. She was picking fights all week, but some feeling told me to check on her before going out that night. That's when I found her passed out in bed. Called the emergency services and they were able to help her, and she is doing great now. But I'll never forget how she shaked and looked terrified when the medics started to treat and take her to the hospital. Story 26. One of my patients was not a fan of good hygiene. She had inverted nipples and a filthy, stinky plug made out of dirt and sweat and old skin, etc. Came out when pulling back her boobs to clean in the nipples. Story 27. I've seen a lot of ducked-up crap, but there's one incident that stands out to me be what it involved a kid. I saw a lady have a grand mal seizure while holding her baby. She was shopping and having a normal day, then suddenly her arms just unfolded and her infant fallen. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard, kind of a cross between an egg breaking and a melon cracking open. We called an ambulance and the mother lived, but I don't think the baby did. Story 28. When I was 17 years, my father died after being in a coma for a week. I went to see him after he passed, but while he was still in his hospital room. He had a piece of plastic in his mouth, probably from a breathing tube or something. I had my little sister with me, who was 14 at the time. While we were stood there, staring at our father's body, a nurse came in to remove the plastic from his mouth. She then tried to close his mouth, but couldn't, so it just stayed open. My sister completely lost it. I was crying and just ended up kissing his forehead, then leaving. It may not sound that bad, but it was an absolutely horrific moment for two teenage girls. Story 29. Around 2 months ago, my older neighbors came back from holiday. Long story short, the older gentleman came back with multiple infections, including pandemic. They both asked me to help and support them with a few manually demanding jobs, which of course is totally fine. A few days after they arrived home, I got a phone call from his wife as she was concerned about her husband's condition. I went upstairs and he was blue and shaking. The shaking stopped and his chest dropped and didn't raise again. Straight an ambulance took them less than 10 minutes to get to us. I'm happy as duck to be able to say he came home just a few days ago, but watching someone go is definitely my scariest experience. Story 30. One day when I was 10 years old, I was heading to work with my father. He delivered candy for a company. Got to eat anything I wanted, was going to be great. So we're on the highway and traffic started to slow down. Once we got to the problem area, I seen a mangled torso laid out in the breakdown lane. Apparently there was a freak motorcycle crash. My father tried to cover my eyes, but it was too late. Image stuck with me for life. Story 31. Was walking down a street in my city years ago to go to dinner, and was one of the first on the scene to see a young man who would take his life away by jumping off a tall building. It was very sad. I reflected that night on what was important, and how desperate a young man must be that death was the last option. Story 32. Met up with two girls I knew, and we decided to all go to pub down the road, step outside, and discover the aftermath of two guys who'd been arguing on the street. One guy pushed the other onto the road and he had been run over by a semi-trailer. Apparently the truck driver didn't even know he'd hit anything and just thought it was a bumpy road. There's a very dead guy on the road. His friends are inconsolable. The idiot that pushed him is still pumped up and doesn't seem to comprehend what's actually happened. The guy that caused it still seemed to think we could do something about the situation. He said, "Don't worry about me, worry about him." We told him it was too late for the other guy. He screamed at us, "It's never too late." The girls I was with suddenly didn't feel like partying anymore, and I made sure they got into a taxi. The police showed up, and I warned them of the gruesome scene ahead to prepare them. I wandered off down the road. On the way, I saw a couple waking down the street towards the incident. I advised them to take a detour down the side street to not see it. They thanked me and took the detour. That was about the best thing I achieved that night. Not letting just one couple see what took me weeks to get out of my head. Story 33. A few years ago, I went out to take my aunt to JFK Airport, about an hour from my house. Earlier that night, I was playing Fortnite with my friends who both lived within a few blocks of me. I had my windows open because it was a super cool summer night and heard a gunshot outside. Didn't really think anything of it because I was in the middle of a game. Went to pick up my aunt about 20 minutes later, drove her to the airport, and got home around 4:30 a.m. After I dropped off her car, I was driving towards my house when I noticed about 10 police cars with their lights on in front of my house. At first, I panicked, thinking it was someone in my family. But as I got closer and pulled into my driveway, I saw something that I could never and still can't unsee. My 17-year-old neighbor's body on the driveway laying face down. I saw a beer can on the edge of his truck, so maybe thought he fell and hit himself. But then I saw my best friend's truck in front of my house. Called him up and found out that my neighbor had taken his life away. Realized the gunshot I heard earlier in the night was actually him pulling the trigger. Story 34. When I was 7 years old and staying at my dad's, illegally since he never had custody of me seeing as he was a known pedo and got me kidnapped, out of the corner of my eye, I saw my dad and one of his friends slip something into my orange juice. The next thing I knew, I was trapped and completely paralyzed, but totally and completely awake and could only move my eyes, and I saw my dad and his friends doing stuff to me, and it felt like it lasted an eternity. Story 35. My dad effectively passed away in my arms. I watched our family dog get hit by a car and the person just drive off. Thankfully, she went on to live many years, just with a lame back leg from that point on. I'm the lone caretaker for my 89-year-old disabled grandma. I love her to death, but understand a partially paralyzed person comes with needing a lot of assistance, and so we have our share of disturbing moments. But the most disturbing is how most everyone abandons you once the caretaking begins. We just don't see most of our family now and quit getting help about the moment we got her home. And here in the States, we get the luxury lower middle class living, medical expenses, inflation causing high grocery bills, all without assistance. That being said, we really are blessed and do have a lot to be grateful for. Story 36. Crawled my way out of a car wreck, battered and had to sit on the side of the road and watch while the car went up in flames with my beautiful girlfriend in it. Since I've developed a real issue with feeling helpless in situations. Story 37. A friend in high school drove drunk to his GF's house leaving a party due to an argument. Well, he didn't make it there. Anyway, his parents made it a point to have an open casket at his viewing. They wanted the lesson to be made clear to all of his friends and peers. I don't remember his real face anymore, just the bloated mess that remained. All around just sad as hell, but a powerful lesson from his parents to us kids back then. Story 38. When I was 17 years old, I was driving down the road and looked out the passenger window and seen in between two houses, which allowed me to see one of the backyards for a solid second and a half. In that time, there was a man sitting in a chair in the backyard with a pistol pressed against the bottom of his jaw, and he pulled the trigger right when I looked. I thought for sure I was tripping, so I circled the block, and by the time I got back, there was a woman throwing up in the front yard, and I drove past and looked back again, going slower this time, and what a sight. Story 39. 1. Living in Joburg, South Africa. My sister went out to the car in our housing complex to get her cigarettes and asked me to stand at the door to make sure she was okay. I stood there watching, and out of nowhere, two guys jumped her with a gun to her head, and she fought back until our dogs bolted past and attacked the guys who sprinted away. We had dachshunds. 2. I work in learning disability care, and on my first day on a new placement, one guy I was told to care for ran past me up the stairs where he isn't allowed to go. He had a tonic-clonic epileptic seizure at the top of the stairs and fell down the stairs with multiple crunches. I tried to catch him, but he slipped out of my grip. He miraculously survived with no lasting damage. I cried for like 5 minutes and then decided I would never let that ever happen again. Story 40. I remember working as a security guard for a hospital. I watched Certificate of Need patients. These were patients from our local asylum who were completely out of their mind. I did my third shift ever for that company, watching a guy who had picked up some pencils and stabbed a worker with it a couple times before turning a fresh one on himself and stabbing his own stomach 6 times. I took the third shift 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. All I did was sit in the hallway outside his door in a mostly dead wing of the intensive care unit. I maybe saw one person an hour. It was just me in a chair in the middle of a dead hallway for 12 hours of the night. I'm freshly 18 at this point and had little experience with anything like this. I made it to about 3 a.m. before passing out in my chair outside his door. I was awoken by the guy I was watching himself. He had broken his own wrist to slip out of the handcuffs, keeping him on the bed. He tapped me on my shoulder to wake me up. I turned and looked at this man who was completely naked, holding his wrist, and he just said, "I need to pee." I decided to try and play it off like everything was normal, as to not escalate the situation. I walked him to the bathroom and immediately called my co while he was inside. My co got there before he got out, and we used restraints to put him back on the bed. Nurses came back in and set him back up. My co, not knowing that I fell asleep, said I did the right thing and that I'd do great at the job. He said he needed more people like me who didn't panic in situations like that and make things worse. I thanked him and then left at 7 a.m. I never came back to do another shift for that security company. Story 41. Me and my dad were possibly the last people to see someone alive before they take his life away. Where I'm from, the beach is within walking distance. And as me and my dad were walking back, we walked past this guy. We both said hello, but he didn't say anything back. He only gave us a quick glance, and he looked pretty miserable. We shrugged it off as just some grumpy person. Took me a minute or two to realize after seeing his face, but I was pretty sure she was someone from my school. Not someone I talked to much, but nonetheless someone I recognized. I think it was the next day we found out he'd take his life away. After I found that out, other things that night started to make sense. For example, we heard sirens later that night. By total chance, it turned out we also talked to this guy my dad knew who had a quad bike. This same quad bike being used to bring the body up to the main road from the path, despite not actually seeing something really graphic like others have posted here, like seeing his body hanging or whatever. The reason I mention this as one of the most disturbing things I've seen is because of the look on the guy's face. It's totally ingrained in my head. He was on his way to do this awful thing because, for whatever reason he decided, was what he had to do. He wasn't being grumpy. He was about to end his life. For a while afterwards, I couldn't stop thinking about what me and my dad might have seen. Had we just headed down a bit later? Or what would have happened if I stopped him and had a chat? Would he have changed his mind? My friends and family snapped me out of thinking like that because it wasn't worth it. That's probably what disturbs me the most about it all. Not actually knowing makes your mind think up all sorts of mad stuff. Story 42. I was on submarines in the United States Navy back in the late 90s. And this is from then. We had civilian contractors doing work on our boat's high-pressure air system. This one guy forgot to secure the air before working on the pipes, and when he broke the seal, the whole thing broke away. He lost most of his hand instantly. The guy was screaming on the deck. Story 43. During my university year, when I was doing my weekly commute to my hometown, in the middle of the way, I saw someone who was driving his motorcycle recklessly. On one part of the road, where there was only one lane for each way, he was pushing to overtake a container truck when he lost balance and bumped to the truck's side and fell down on the other lane where a speeding bus was passing through. Story 44. Probably not the most. Sad to say I was visiting Pakistan with the war happening in Islamabad airport. This man, with his pregnant wife and 3-year-old kid, she said something. He smacked the duck and pushed her to the ground in front of all these people at the airport. Crap, 7 months pregnant and a kid right there. He saw nothing wrong with it. My heart was bleeding for her. Seemed to tolerate it. I walked past and touched her shoulder. It's an Asian cultural thing. I hope she left his ugly ass. Story 45. A child getting the crap kicked out of them by a large group, cars driving by doing nothing, and school officials turning their head as not to see. I only saw because it was loud enough that me inside of my house heard something and ran out to help. All I really had to do was loud yell and threaten to cross the street, and the kids stopped. I am not physically large or threatening normally. I hope everyone who did nothing to help that kid gets raging herpes that never has downtime. Story 46. When I was in Navy boot camp years ago, while I was on watch one night, some guy from the 3rd floor decided to swallow a double-edged razor blade, then do a swan dive from the 3rd floor balcony onto the pavement. The pavement smashed his skull and left bits of him all over the pavement. Then, about 20 years later, I was working as an off-road truck driver in the oil fields. When last one night, I came across some tail lights in the road ahead of me. When I noticed that the 2 red tail lights were both on the same side of the road, and the 2 amber running lights were both on the other side of the road, then I saw the shadow of the truck lying on its side. I got out and saw somebody sitting on the ground in the middle of the road, highlighted by his truck's headlights. I walked up and asked, "Are you all right, buddy?" There was no answer. Then I looked and he passed away. This was out in the New Mexican desert on a 4WD road, so it took over an hour to get help out there. He survived long enough for them to get there, but he passed away in the hospital a few hours later. That was tough. Story 47. My cat had been missing for 5 days. He'd been missing before for around 3 days when he came back with a leg broken in 2 places. I was getting pretty worried when I came home from school. After about 5 minutes of me getting back, I heard a loud yowl from outside. I opened the door to find my cat. He had a huge gash on his side that was the length of his torso. The smell of rotting flesh was just horrible, and I nearly threw up on the spot. I had to wrap him up in a towel and hold him on my lap whilst I called my dad, who was at work, so the cat wouldn't move. The vets thought that he wouldn't survive the surgery, but he somehow did, and is still alive today. Story 48. I watched my husband dive into our pool and break his neck. He made a full recovery, thankfully. But the trauma doc said his type of injury leads to either death or paralysis about 9% of the time. He was very lucky.